Elias swore the cabin was enough, until the stranger's name on his lips made him a husband by morning and a protector by dusk. Now a powerful rancher wants what he just learned to love. The scent of dry dust and sun-baked timber filled Elias's small cabin, a home built for one and lived in by one. The single bed was neatly made, the blanket pulled taut over the thin mattress. A low lamp sat on a small, hand-carved table, its oil untouched as the long summer twilight still held the room in a soft, gray glow. His rifle, cleaned and oiled, rested on its pegs above the stone hearth, a silent testament to the solitude he had cultivated like the rows of stubborn corn in his field. He moved through the quiet space with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, his hands, calloused and capable, finding each familiar object without a thought. He had come to this frontier valley, seeking silence, a place where the ghosts of his past were drowned out by the rustle of wind through the tall prairie grass. Here, his world was circumscribed by the reach of his own arms. The axe he swung, the plow he guided, the cup he lifted to his lips. It was a life of deliberate, lonely peace. He ate his supper of beans and dried jerky, standing by the open doorway, watching the sun bleed its last colors across the horizon. The air was warm, thick with the thrum of cicadas, a sound that underscored the profound stillness of his existence. He had everything he needed, and he wanted nothing more. He washed his plate in the basin, the scrape of the cloth against the tin, the only sound in the deepening twilight. As he latched the door for the night, the simple click of the bolts sliding home was a familiar comfort, a final, quiet period on another solitary day. He did not know that tonight was the last night his house would feel this empty, that the silence he had so carefully curated was about to be broken, not by force, but by a presence that would slowly, irrevocably reshape the contours of his world. The knock on his door came just after dawn, sharp and insistent. It was a sound so alien in his routine that Elias froze, his hand halfway through sharpening a scythe blade. He set the stone down, the silence of the room now taut with anticipation. Outside stood Preacher Miller, his face a mask of grim piety, and beside him a young woman. She stood with a ramrod straightness that seemed to defy the slight tremble in her hands, her gaze fixed on a point just past Elias's shoulder. It was the preacher's daughter, Elara. Elias had seen her in the dusty street of the nearby settlement, a figure of quiet dignity who always seemed to carry an invisible weight. The preacher cleared his throat, his eyes sweeping over Elias's simple cabin with a look of distaste. "Elias," he began, his voice devoid of its usual Sunday morning warmth, "there has been an incident. My daughter's reputation is compromised." He spoke of a land dispute, of a coercive and entitled rancher named Thorne, who had used threats against Miller's claim to try and force Elara's hand in marriage. Miller, in a desperate, foolish gambit to protect his land without surrendering his daughter to a predator, had instead publicly named Elias as her intended. It was a lie, a shield made of another man's name, and it had trapped them all. "You are a man of honor, I am told," Miller said, the words a cage. "You will make this right. You will marry her." Elara's head snapped up, her eyes finally meeting Elias's. In their depth, he saw not a plea for rescue, but a blaze of fierce, cornered pride. She was a survivor. He recognized that instantly. She was not a prize to be bartered, and her father's desperate act had put her in an even more precarious position. Elias looked from the preacher's sweating face to the daughter's defiant one. He could refuse. He could send them away and return to his solitude. But when he looked at Elara, at the way she held herself together when her world was falling apart, he saw not a burden, but a reflection of his own guarded soul. He thought of Thorne, a man whose entitlement was a poison in the valley. To leave her to that fate, or to the public shame her father had engineered, felt like a violence he could not permit. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will," he said, the two words feeling heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. The preacher's relief was immediate and cloying. Elara's expression, however, remained unreadable as she crossed the threshold into the house that was now, by decree, her home. The door remained open, the morning light spilling in, but the quiet solitude of Elias's life had just ended. The first days were a study in silent, careful navigation. Elara moved through his small cabin with a quiet purposefulness that both respected and reshaped the space. She did not speak much, and neither did he. Words, it seemed, were a currency neither of them trusted. Instead, their communication began in a language of shared tasks. He would find a stack of firewood by the hearth, cut to the perfect length for his stove, and know she had been there. She would come into the kitchen to find the heavy water buckets already filled, a silent acknowledgment of her labor. They were two planets in a careful orbit, their gravity felt in small, practical gestures. One afternoon, he was mending a harness in the sliver of shade beside the barn, his fingers struggling with the stiff, thick leather and a bent needle. He heard the soft fall of her footsteps and looked up. Elara stood there, a small tin in her hands. She opened it without a word and offered it to him. Inside was a block of beeswax. She simply pointed to the thread. He took the tin, their fingers brushing for a fleeting electric moment. The touch was nothing and everything. He ran the thread over the wax, and it slid through the leather with newfound ease. When he looked up to thank her, she was already walking back to the cabin, her shoulders set with that familiar, proud straightness. That evening, she was scrubbing potatoes at the basin, her back to him. He approached slowly, making sure his steps were audible, a habit he was forming around her, a constant signal of his presence so as not to startle. "I'll do that," he said, his voice quiet. She shook her head, not turning. "My hands are my own." The words were soft, but their meaning was clear. He understood. It was not about the task. It was about her autonomy. He simply nodded and picked up a clean cloth to dry the dishes she had already washed, working beside her in a comfortable, shared silence. Trust was not being built in grand pronouncements, but in the small, repeated proof that he would not command, that he would respect the boundaries she drew around herself. He was learning to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the slight tightening of her jaw, the moment she allowed herself a small, unguarded breath. And in these quiet, domestic rhythms, a fragile, unspoken longing began to take root. Weeks bled into a month, and the summer heat settled deep into the bones of the valley. The rhythm of their lives was now a familiar, quiet cadence. The turning point, the moment something shifted from shared space to shared intimacy, came on a sweltering evening. A storm had been threatening all day, the air thick and heavy with unspoken tension. When the rain finally broke, it was a deluge, drumming a frantic, loud rhythm on the cabin roof. Elias had been out checking on the livestock, and he returned soaked to the skin, his shirt clinging to his back. He entered the cabin to find Elara had lit a second lamp, chasing the storm-driven gloom from the corners of the room. A pot of something savory simmered on the stove. It sent a warm welcome against the chill of the rain. She looked up as he dripped onto the floorboards, her expression holding a flicker of concern. "You're soaked," she stated, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. He nodded, suddenly feeling large and clumsy in the small, warm space. The new calf was spooked. He started to turn away, intending to change in the small, curtained-off corner that served as his bedroom. But she spoke again. "Wait." She retrieved the clean, dry cloth she used for wrapping fresh-baked bread and held it out to him. "Your hair." It was an invitation, not a command. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before he lowered his head slightly. Her touch was incredibly gentle as she dried his hair, her fingers careful and deliberate. The scent of rain and damp earth on him mingled with the scent of chamomile that seemed to always cling to her. He could feel the warmth of her body close to his, a stark contrast to the cold rain still on his skin. It was the most profound closeness they had yet shared, a chosen moment of care that had nothing to do with chores or necessity. When she finished, her hand lingered for a second on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She simply nodded, her eyes soft in the lamplight. They ate their supper in a comfortable silence, the roar of the storm outside a distant counterpoint to the quiet intimacy that had bloomed between them. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like his space that she was occupying. It felt like theirs. The fragile peace of their shared home was shattered by the arrival of Thorne. He rode up to the cabin one afternoon, his expensive saddle and confident posture a stark contrast to Elias's quiet homestead. He dismounted, his eyes, cold and possessive, immediately finding Elara, who was tending her small herb garden near the porch. Elias stepped out of the barn, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife on his belt before he forced himself to relax his grip. Thorne ignored him, his smile a predatory curve aimed solely at Elara. "Miller's girl," he said, his voice thick with entitlement. "I heard you'd taken up with this homesteader. A shack in the dirt is a poor trade for what I could offer you." Elara rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am where I choose to be, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady despite the man's invasive stare. Thorne's gaze flickered to Elias, dismissing him as little more than a piece of the landscape. "He can't protect you," Thorne sneered. "This land, this house, it's all temporary. When I own this valley, I'll have whatever and whoever I want." The threat was clear, aimed not just at Elias's property, but at Elara's safety and autonomy. Elias moved to stand slightly in front of her, a subtle, protective shift. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply met Thorne's gaze. "She is my wife," Elias said, the words spoken with a quiet finality that carried more weight than any shouted threat. "You are not welcome here." Thorne's face darkened with rage. He was a man used to getting his way through bluster and intimidation, and Elias's calm refusal to be baited infuriated him. "This isn't over," he snarled, swinging himself back onto his horse. He galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, choking silence in his wake. Elara's hand, which had been clenched into a fist at her side, slowly uncurled. Elias turned to her, his own heart pounding with a cold, protective fury. He saw the tremor she was trying to hide, the shadow of fear in her eyes. He had the overwhelming urge to reach out, to pull her into his arms, and shield her from the ugliness of the world. But he didn't. Instead, he simply asked, his voice low and serious, "Are you all right?" Her gaze met his, and in that shared look, their bond, forged in quiet moments, was tempered into something stronger by the heat of a common threat. The encounter with Thorne left a lingering tension in the air. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of routine, but a space filled with unspoken fears and possibilities. Elara was mending one of Elias's shirts by the lamplight, her stitches small and precise. Elias was cleaning his rifle, the methodical, repetitive motion a balm to his frayed nerves. He was scanning the darkness outside the window, every shadow looking like a threat. He was no longer just protecting his home. He was protecting her. He set the rifle down, the soft click of the metal echoing in the room. "He will not touch you," Elias said, breaking the silence. It was not a boast. It was a vow. Elara looked up from her sewing, her needle poised in midair. Her eyes searched his face in the flickering light. "I know," she whispered. The simple trust in her voice undid something in him. He had spent years building walls around himself, and in 2 words she had walked straight through them. He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, a position of supplication that felt more natural than standing over her. "Elara," he said, speaking her name with a reverence he hadn't known he possessed. "This arrangement, it was forced upon you. But my choice, now, is not. I choose this. I choose you. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, a silent question. She put down her sewing and placed her hand in his. His calloused palm enveloped her smaller one, the touch gentle, careful. I have never been a man of many words, he continued, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. But I need you to know. My life was quiet before, but with you, it is whole. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. My father sought to use you as a shield, Elias, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But you have been my shelter. In the warm glow of the lamplight, surrounded by the simple domestic intimacy they had built, they chose each other. Not because of a preacher's desperate lie or a rancher's cruel threat, but because in the quiet spaces between their solitary lives, they had found a home in one another. He lifted her hand and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to her knuckles, a pledge more binding than any wedding vows they had been forced to speak. The invitation was clear in his eyes when he finally met hers again. When he rose and offered his hand, she took it without hesitation, choosing to stay by his side by choice. The next day, Elias rode into the settlement for supplies. It was a necessary trip, but one he made with a heavy sense of unease, leaving Elara alone. As he was loading sacks of flour onto his mule, he saw Thorne and two of his hired hands loitering outside the general store. They were watching him, their intentions as clear as the midday sun. Elias finished his task, his movements deliberate, betraying none of the cold anger coiling in his gut. As he prepared to leave, Thorne blocked his path. I told you this wasn't over, Thorne said, his voice low and menacing. That woman should have been mine. That land will be mine. The townspeople passing by slowed their steps, sensing the imminent confrontation. This was the public test, a moment of open challenge. Elias looked past Thorne, his gaze steady. My wife is at home, he said, his voice calm and clear for all to hear. And my land is not for sale. He made to move around Thorne, but the man grabbed the mule's rein. You think you can stand against me? You're nothing but a dirt scratcher. Elias slowly turned his head to look at Thorne's hand on the rein. Then he met his eyes. Let go, he said. The quiet command held more power than a shout. At that moment, Elara appeared at the end of the street, a basket on her arm. She had walked to town, unwilling to remain a passive figure waiting at home. Her eyes met Elias's across the dusty street, and a silent understanding passed between them. She did not look afraid. She looked resolute. Seeing her, standing there with a quiet strength that defied Thorne's bluster, solidified Elias's resolve. This was not just about him anymore. It was about the future they had promised each other in the lamplight. With a sudden, swift movement, Elias grabbed Thorne's wrist, his grip like iron. He did not throw a punch. He simply peeled the man's fingers from the rein and pushed him back a step. The force of it was startling, a display of contained strength that stunned Thorne into silence. Elias turned his back on him, an act of ultimate dismissal, and walked to Elara. He took the basket from her arm. Let's go home, he said softly. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a public gesture of possession and protection that was also deeply tender. They walked away together, leaving Thorne humiliated and fuming in the middle of the street, the eyes of the entire town upon him. They had made their choice, not with violence, but with a united, unshakable front. They chose each other openly and clearly. The walk back to the cabin was quiet. Elias carried the basket of supplies, his other hand never leaving the small of Elara's back. It was a constant, reassuring pressure, a physical manifestation of his vow. When they arrived, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, filling the small room with a warm, golden light. The tension of the confrontation in town still clung to them, a fine dust that needed to be washed away. Elara set about putting away the supplies, her movements precise, almost brittle. Elias watched her, recognizing the fragile control she was exerting over her emotions. He went to the basin and pumped fresh, cool water into a bowl. He took a clean cloth and walked to where she stood, her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table. "Elara," he said softly. She turned, and he saw the unshed tears shimmering in her eyes. He didn't speak again. He simply took her hand, his thumb gently stroking the back of it, and led her to a chair. He knelt before her, just as he had the night before, and began to gently wipe the dust of the road from her face with a damp cloth. The gesture was tender, an act of service, of aftercare. He cleansed her skin with a reverence that spoke of devotion, his touch careful on her cheekbones, her jaw, her forehead. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the faint dampness left by the cloth. He wiped that away, too. When he was done, he held her hand in both of his, simply holding her pulse, grounding her. "He will not trouble us again," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. We made our stand. She opened her eyes, her gaze clear and full of a deep, abiding love. "You did not fight him," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "You simply erased him." He nodded. "You are not a prize to be won in a brawl." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her palm this time, a gesture of profound intimacy. In the quiet of their home, with the dust of the outside world washed away, they found solace, not in victory, but in the gentle, reaffirming acts of care that bound them together. The ordeal was over, and what remained was the quiet, steadfast tenderness between them. With Thorne's public humiliation, a sense of peace settled over the small homestead. The threat had passed, leaving behind not a scar, but a stronger foundation for the life Elias and Elara were building. The days fell back into their familiar rhythm, but now it was a rhythm of two people moving in effortless concert. The silence between them was no longer a space of careful negotiation, but of deep, comfortable understanding. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Elias found Elara by the small window, looking out at the vast, darkening prairie. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. For a long while, they just stood together, watching the first stars begin to prick the canopy of the sky. "When I was a girl," Elara said, her voice soft, "I used to think the stars were holes in a great, dark blanket, letting the light from heaven shine through." Elias considered this. "I always saw them as embers," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "From a fire so big you couldn't imagine it." He turned to look at her, her profile etched in the soft light from the lamp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clumsily carved wooden bird. He had been working on it for weeks, in stolen moments in the barn. It was rough, the knife marks still visible, but the shape was undeniably that of a swallow, its wings swept back as if in mid-flight. He placed it in her palm. It was not a jewel or a fancy gift, but it was a piece of him, of his time, his care. She closed her fingers around it, her touch gentle. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It was a token, a symbol of devotion given and received. He took her hand, the small bird nestled between their palms. "I'm not much for promises spoken in front of crowds," he said, his gaze locked with hers. "But I make you this one here. This will be your home, always. You will be safe here. You will be cherished here." It was a vow spoken in plain speech, simple and direct, but it held the weight of his entire being. "And I will stay," she answered, her own quiet vow sealing his. It was not an ending, but a beginning. Their future was not a grand destination, but the simple, profound promise of waking up to face each new day, together. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, settled joy. The unspoken question of their future had been answered, not with a grand declaration, but with the simple, declarative act of staying. Their life together unfolded in a series of small, intimate tableaus. Elias would be splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat for their homestead. And he would look up to see Elara on the porch, a small, unguarded smile on her face as she watched him. She would be kneading bread, her hands dusted with flour, and feel his presence behind her. He would place a freshly picked wildflower on the table, a silent offering that spoke volumes. Their home, once a bastion of solitude for him and a place of refuge for her, had transformed. It was now a shared sanctuary, every corner filled with the quiet evidence of their life together. One morning, Elara found him at his workbench, carefully repairing the delicate spine of one of the few books she had managed to bring with her. He handled the fragile pages with the same gentle precision he used to touch her face. It was in these small, repeated acts of service that he showed his love, a language she had become fluent in. She came to understand the fierce protectiveness in him, not as a desire to control, but as a deep-seated need to ensure her safety and happiness. He, in turn, saw her resilience not as hardness, but as a testament to her incredible emotional bravery, a strength that he admired more than any physical power. Their love was not a raging fire, but a steady, warm hearth that heated their home from the inside out. It was in the way he always made sure the lamp was full, so she would never have to sit in the dark. It was in the way she mended his worn-out gloves, her stitches a silent prayer for his safety. They had been forced together by circumstance, two lonely souls adrift in a harsh world. But in the quiet domesticity of shared chores, thin walls, and candlelit evenings, they had found in each other a belonging that neither had ever known. They had built a family, not of blood, but of choice, a bond forged in respect, sealed with a quiet promise, and destined to last a lifetime. The summer heat began to soften, giving way to the first cool whispers of autumn. The corn in the fields was high, and the days were filled with the steady work of harvesting. Elias and Elara worked side by side, a comfortable, efficient team. The physical labor was demanding, but it was shared, and at the end of the day, they would return to their cabin, tired but content. The small house was no longer a place of quiet tension, but of warmth and life. Elara had planted a small pot of herbs on the windowsill, and its fresh scent mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke and baking bread. One evening, after a long day in the fields, they sat at the small table, sharing a simple meal. A comfortable silence settled between them, the only sounds the clink of their forks against the tin plates and the chirping of crickets outside. Elara looked at Elias, at his strong, capable hands, now resting on the table. They were the hands of a protector, hands that could build a house, wield an axe, and defend a home. But they were also the hands that had so gently dried his hair, that had held hers with such reverence, that had carved a small wooden bird as a token of his love. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He immediately turned his palm up, lacing his fingers with hers. It was a simple, familiar gesture, one they now shared often. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet of the room. He considered her question for a moment, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "My life wasn't silent before," he answered, his voice low and thoughtful. "It was just empty. The noise you've brought into my life. It's the only sound I ever want to hear." Her heart swelled at his words, a feeling of such profound love and gratitude that it almost took her breath away. In his stoic, careful way, he had just told her everything. He had told her she was his home, his peace, his future. She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining in the lamplight. No more words were needed. The vow they had made to each other was not a single event, but a continuous, daily choice reaffirmed in every shared glance, every gentle touch, every quiet moment spent together in the small cabin that had become their entire world. The preacher's daughter had not just found a protector in the stoic cowboy. She had found her partner. And the lonely homesteader had not just been given a wife. He had been given his greatest blessing. The first frost laid a silver blanket over the valley, and the last of the harvest was stored away for the winter. The rhythm of their life shifted with the seasons, turning inward. The world outside grew colder, but inside the small cabin, a steady warmth radiated from the hearth they tended together. The thin walls, once a symbol of their forced proximity, were now simply the boundary of their shared world, a world that felt complete and whole. Elias spent the shorter days reinforcing the barn and carving small, practical things for the house. Elara spent her time weaving and preserving the last of the garden's bounty. They moved around each other with an ingrained, intimate knowledge of one another's habits and needs. He knew she liked her tea with a touch of honey. She knew he preferred to sit in the chair closest to the window, where he could watch the land. Their love, which had grown in the small gestures of daily life, had now settled into the very foundation of their home. One night, as a cold wind howled outside, Elias watched Elara as she read by the firelight, her face soft and serene. He felt a wave of such fierce, tender devotion that it was almost painful. He had spent so much of his life believing that belonging was something you fought for, something you carved out of a hostile world with your own two hands. But she had shown him that true belonging was not a place, but a person. It was the safety of being known, the peace of being accepted, the quiet joy of a shared future. He rose from his chair and went to her, kneeling by her side. She looked up from her book, a questioning smile on her lips. He didn't speak. He simply took her hand, the one that so often held his, and brought it to his heart. He held it there, letting her feel its steady, devoted beat. It was a promise, a vow, and a thank you, all without a single word. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, a micro-intimacy that had become their own secret language. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the wind whistling, two solitary souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. The future was unwritten, a quiet promise stretching out before them, as vast and as beautiful as the star-filled frontier sky.